So I think we've all used the word evidence quite a lot already today, but different people have different understandings of what that means. So just as an initial question to get the ball rolling on our discussion, I wanted to turn back to our four panelists and ask, what does evidence mean to you? So we'll start with Aninia. When you use that term, what does that mean to you? You're talking about how the Sphere standards have always been based on evidence. So how would you understand that that term?
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Evidence is for Sphere the information and the facts that are available to help us to make a statement, no? And for Sphere, evidence can have various forms, and there's not necessarily a ranking among different levels of evidence. For example, there is the research and controlled studies, very much with a systematic methodology behind. Then there's expert opinion, there's best practice by practitioners. And why we can say that those various elements are evidence is because the way the way Sphere develops standards is in this participatory and transparent way, where people are asked what works for them and what doesn't and why. And I mean, it's true that also with other standards handbooks, you will see that at some point you need to start from somewhere, and there's also this notion of common sense that is quite strong within Sphere. And with other standards, and you will see that a set of standards, when they start out, may have a best educated guess as a start, and then as the standards live and are revised and new feedback comes in, some of those guesses are consolidated and confirmed, and others need to be revised and adjusted. Maybe I'll stop there.
Great. That's great. Perfect. And turning to Kit and Jude, maybe is there anything that you would want to add or build on from Aninia's description of how Sphere thinks about evidence? Starting with you, Kit.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about that. I think in the WASH sector as a whole, it's a little bit of a mix between best practice, if you like, or good enough practice, or expert opinion, that kind of all lumps together, and what's practical. A couple of people have used the term common sense, and I think common sense is grounded in what actually works. I also think there's a bit of an element that they've become somewhat self-sustaining, and it links to what Aninia just said about they were established in the original version of the handbook, or even before, as a guidance rule of thumb that a couple of agencies thought worked well together, or a couple of people thought worked well in their particular context. And as the contexts have grown, and as the sector has grown, and as we've ended up in more and more different places, they've kind of taken on a life of their own. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in this particular exercise is to ground them in something that's a little bit more than that, let's say. That's what I would add to what Aninia has already said.
Great, thanks so much. And Jude?
Yeah, so not huge amounts to add, because I think that they've pretty much got it covered. But I think it's just to do with, that for me, it's making sure that information, whatever that is kind of collected in such a way that we can be confident that what we're doing or what we're putting in a set of standards is achieving what we think it's achieving, whether that's through, as you say, common sense or through to an RCT. But it's just calling it evidence to give ourselves enough confidence that we're doing the right thing.
Great. And Severin, does your perspective, having worked at LSHTM for a few years and having done this academic study, does that give you a different perspective on evidence, or would you broadly agree with what's been said?
what I was presenting today, for example, it was based on, it was scientific evidence. And of course, in my conclusion, as you saw, I do agree with Aninia and with Kit and Jude that, you know, expert opinion, common sense, I forgot to mention common sense, but I do think that that can also be very valid, are also important things. In my vocabulary, I don't necessarily call that evidence, but it's important not to separate the different types of sources for information. Otherwise, people would just rank them and think that one is better than the other. So I understand that they would want to call it all evidence. But yeah, no, I agree broadly, but it's true that what I was talking about was more scientific evidence.
Great, great. Really helpful there. I think we get a good spectrum of perspectives, but at the same time, you know, we're kind of on the same page there, and we all care. It sounds like across all of the definitions that you've mentioned, there is a concern ultimately that whatever this is, you know, good enough practice, expert opinion, scientific evidence that needs to be relevant and accurate in order to inform the Sphere standards. So I wanted to build on that question and connect this to a question we've received on the Q&A. And by the way, I should take the opportunity to mention to other attendees on the webinar, please use the questions box to submit your question, and we can pose it to our panelists. Oliver Hoffman from Johanniter International Assistance has been posing the question, what evidence are you looking for with the Sphere standards? And he's specifically wanting to understand, are you talking about evidence for standards or evidence for the indicators? So maybe there's a question there about the terminology. I know, Aninia, you went a bit quickly through the new structure, but maybe you could clarify which element there you are looking for evidence for. And just a reflection here that it seems that you know, the Sphere Handbook, it covers such a wide variety of issues. So there's a wide variety of sectors, from food security to protection to health. And then also you're looking at different areas. So some of your comments in the presentations have been talking about supporting systems, while others are about, you know, direct implementation at a project level. So maybe some reflection from Aninia and then Kit and then Severin on whether or not we need different types of evidence that are addressing these different areas, or is there one sort of evidence that's good for all? So maybe taking that question about what kind of evidence are you looking for? Is it for standards or indicators, and what's the difference there? And do you think you can just use one kind of type of evidence for all of that? So going to you first, Aninia.
Yes, thank you. We are looking at evidence for the indicators mostly. The standards are an expression of rights, the way Sphere is conceived, and are quite organized in a qualitative way, expressing a right, sort of outcome. And the indicators really are where we need to explain this notion of minimum requirement and minimum indicator. And it all runs around the idea that to establish a safe environment for people who have been displaced, hit by disaster, for them to survive with a certain amount of dignity and not their health situation not deteriorating. That is the notion of evidence there. And clearly different, as we've said before, different sectors have different approaches to evidence. The health sector is much more prone to working with scientific evidence. It also depends on how new or established a certain area, sector, you know, theme is. And what I just remembered, the child protection minimum standards, when they were first published, someone said, well, some of those indicators were actually really, you know, a best guess. But the fact that they have been written down and become visible in a more structured way in a set of standards, that visibility allowed people then to start reflecting on those indicators and realize, well, do they work, do they not? And with the next revision, there was a much more informed discussion on the usability and feasibility of a certain indicator than had that information never made it into the handbook in the first place. So there must be different levels of certainty and confidence with which you can describe and support an indicator over time.
Really interesting. That goes back to what Jude was talking about with the better than nothing approach. You know, we basically need to get this minimum standard. So even without an existing evidence base, what can we try and reach for? Great. Jude, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Yes. So I think we do, as Aninia said, that it's looking for the evidence for the indicators is very important. But there are still parts of health that still do require some evidence for the actual action too, and whether that's action or that's mode of delivery as well. That's still something that we're looking for in parts of health, as well as the indicator themselves. It's not huge things, but yeah, that's important. So just thinking about use of vouchers, for example, in health, there's so much discussion. There's some quite sort of passionate discussion about it, you know, causing more harm than good in certain contexts. And I think also another thing that potentially comes into the actions rather than the indicators too is some of the cost effectiveness and health prioritization, which does form part of the section. So the bulk of it is the indicators, but there are also these actions which predominantly relate to mode of delivery rather than actual intervention. But yeah, so that's how we're approaching it, and that's how we're approaching looking for evidence generally.
Great, really helpful. So indicators and actions, which kind of speaks to the classical, you know, evidence on implementation science. Really interesting. We're going to move to Kit actually, and pick up on one of the points, Kit, that came up in your presentation, but also in Severin's presentation. So we saw in Severin's presentation that one of the areas where the number of studies available to map to the Sphere standards was lowest. And I think you know, the WASH is a sector where this has been kind of the reputation for WASH for a while, that the evidence base is considered a bit low. As a recent example of this, the Humanitarian Evidence Program, which was a joint initiative between Oxfam and the Feinstein Center at Tufts University, they carried out a number of systematic reviews, and the systematic review for WASH reviewed 15,000 or over 15,000 articles on WASH, but only 47 of those 15,000 met the quality criteria to be included as an evidence base to inform the WASH sector. So given that this formal evidence base, and I think we're putting through the link to that publication for people who are interested in following up on that study. Given that the formal evidence base for WASH is lacking, wanted to ask you where else you've been looking to find empirical support for your chapter standards. You've mentioned the webinar next week. Maybe you could talk a bit more about other resources that you and your chapter co-author have been looking to draw on. And speaking of your co-author, Jenny Lam is with us in the chat box, and I just want to read out something that she's typed here because I think it pertains to this question and might connect to what you have to say on the topic, Kit. So Jenny has been saying that, you know, the WASH sector and the WASH chapter in the approach to evidence needs to move away from a numbers-focused approach. The evidence is too much about numbers in WASH and not enough about the so what. We need efforts to look at meaningful measurement of our outcomes, outputs, activities, etc., that provide us with better and tangible evidence. So Kit, maybe if you can reflect on how you've been trying to move away from numbers to looking at these meaningful measurements of outcomes, outputs, and activities, and what does that mean for you in terms of where you have to look for those references, given that the formal evidence base has been so weak?
Yeah, I was actually just chatting to Jenny offline as well, and I think there's a couple of different areas use evidence to make the the standard in and of itself a lot stronger. And one of those things is we actually did take a look at the standards themselves. Aninia's right, they are an expression of human right, and we were trying to look for existing programs and practices and activities that I guess strengthen that right. So that is exactly why we have these two new subdomains, looking at WASH in a health response and WASH in a nutrition response. We probably have to find a better word for that. At the same time, when Anini is talked about also that those minimum requirements are a red flag, if you like. So in a different context, what's the evidence to show us that we need to be doing something? And historically, we've settled on those quantitative, yeah, that's the right way around, quantitative indicators of number of litres of water per person per day and buckets and distances and all of that kind of stuff. And we're trying to lift that discussion so that we're looking at the outcome, if you like. I think Jenny used the so what, or somebody else used the so what question. So what if we don't provide what we've said we'd provide? Is the outcome actually going to be different? And I guess it very much for us, the concept of what is evidence. As has been rightly pointed out, there are very few randomized controlled trials or as Severin's word, scientific, well-studied pieces of evidence that allow us to pick those numbers. They're the ones we've used for a very long time. We're trying to shake that up. We're trying to make sure that anything we put in there is useful for people to be able to say, okay, so we've got a problem here. And that's kind of where they initially came from anyway. I mean, 15 litres per person per day it's very hard to live with any sort of dignity on 15 litres of water for a day. So what's the consequence for that? And taking that then to the field level is to say, okay, if you choose to use that number in your context, what are the consequences of that? Can you actually reach that number for starters, or is there another way that you want to be looking at it? And in this sense, we're trying to force people back to the standard to say, what are you actually trying to do here? And in this case, we're trying to ensure that people have access to an appropriate, adequate, safe amount of water for their needs, and make sure that the context, what that number might be. We had a long debate about whether we keep the numbers. We probably will keep the numbers in some sort of shape, but they won't be that simple one number. It'll certainly be looking at broadening the context to say that, okay, if you're in this kind of a context, this is a number where you might like to start the discussion, but you're going to have the discussion. We also recognize that the numbers are extremely useful for people who are perhaps working in really remote places, who don't have access to a lot of resources from their agency or from national platforms or from national governments, and it's useful for them to be able to have something that they can start thinking about. How am I going to plan this? So in that sense, we're looking at numbers as being contextualized in terms of a minimum requirement, but we're also looking to have a planning aspect to that number. I think I got a little bit off topic there. Oh, that's right. Sorry. We are looking for that kind. Yeah, sorry. We are looking for that kind of discussion in a really broad group of people. One of the problems that we've faced over and over in any of the big forums for WASH is it's the same people keep turning up who are brilliant. They're fantastic and they add a lot of value to the discussions, but we've been trying to reach out. So we forcefully went looking for other people who work in the sector, people that we don't normally meet face-to-face with on a regular basis. So we went to local government actors, particularly urban local government actors. We went to the private sector. We've definitely brought the academics into the discussion, and that's part of what we'll be doing a lot more of in the coming, I guess, weeks and hopefully weeks, to try and strengthen what's already in there. We recognize it's a little weak to start with. We were hoping to have it stronger to start with, but I think we've focused very strongly on on the standard to start with, and now we're trying to sort of flesh that out a little bit. That's it.
Great. No, really, really interesting. And as Aninia, I think, said earlier, we could talk about this all day. I think what is really striking, especially from your comments, is how you're really trying to get people to engage with the standards in such a way that, you know, evidence is everyone's responsibility, right? So they have to intellectually engage with the standard when they implement it, rather than implementing it as if it's a recipe book. And I think it just reminds us all that we all have a responsibility to play in making sure that everything is fit to context, and that we have the right information and learning from that context that's informing the implementation. So really interesting. Jude, I want to turn to you. We were going to talk about context later, but in the interest of time, I'll kind of combine this question with the context issue. We were talking about how in the health sector, in your presentation, you were mentioning how there's quite a lot of data out there. There's a lot of studies. So we wanted to hear from you how easy it's been, or how difficult it's been, to get accessible summaries and syntheses of that data and of that research. And maybe if you could also touch on that contextualization issue that you briefly mentioned in your presentation. What references are you using to guide you in contextualizing the health indicators?
Okay, so it has been relatively easy to get hold of studies and synthesized, well, synthesized data. So from Evidence Aid, from Tropical School, from various other bodies that are pulling information and studies together. A bit of a limitation lies in that they exist. If, you know, there might be a case study, there might be a report of a certain response, but it doesn't necessarily help an implementer on its transferability and its applicability, and actually where it sits within the current body of evidence. So that's something that having various groups, and Severine certainly trying to help implementers and say, well, this was a good quality study, this wasn't a good quality study, and then actually also working I suppose across the sector to suggest more studies that need to be done, and modalities for that as well. And yes, that then definitely falls into the question of contextualization. There is so much variation in the opinion, I suppose, on the contextualization. Some experts will say, absolutely, this is the only way to manage this kind of an outbreak, irrespective of context. And then, you know, talking about the same disease, others will say, absolutely no. We have been working with local actors, and we've done this in various ways. So going out to for consultation in various emergencies across the world. Also looking at kind of retrospective analyses of emergencies that have already happened. And again, even within emergencies, you know, working within the same area, there is a very different, you know, people suggest very different indicators and very different minimum standards, which is very interesting. Often local actors will say, well, we are using government guidance, we are using existing specific guidance. So, you know, when it comes to cholera, there is the MSF guidance and WHO guidance that already exists. So they will say, well, then that will form the indicator. Or if there's government guidance, then that is what exists as well. So coming up with, as Kit said, coming up with a number will be difficult. But actually then it's to do with a kind of a safety, a very much a minimum, and then making sure that within the text, within the document, and within how it's presented, just making sure that doesn't mean that local actors, implementers, whoever, can't then look at it and go, well, do you know what, we can do better, or we already have good local evidence for this that we will use as our, well, not necessarily as a, or no, as their own minimum rather than the overall minimum. So making it a very kind of, you know, minimum of safety and to ensure accountability, I suppose, in some ways as well.
Great, thanks so much. I want to turn to Severin. We've talked about the role of expert or common sense knowledge in shaping the Sphere standards. You also mentioned that you agree that practitioner expertise is important. Can you talk about how this might be combined with scientific evidence and how to tell if practitioner expertise is of sufficient quality? And I guess a more provocative way of putting this is if practitioner expertise is enough, then why do we need any scientific evidence at all? Or how do we know when we need to actually fill a gap with new RCTs or a new study? And how do we know when we can rely on the existing common sense knowledge and practice that's out there? So over to you, Severin.
Thanks, Alice. That's a tough one. But yeah, I think that it's important really to try not to have this scale of what is best evidence and what counts more than other things, because otherwise, as we talked before, things like common sense or expert opinion will not be valued, and the indicators that are supported by that kind of information will be seen as less important as indicators that are supported by scientific evidence. I also believe that a lot of expert consensus comes from obviously their experience, and a lot of the time that experience is based on intervention and studies and scientific evidence, but not necessarily in a humanitarian context. I know that for my field, nutrition, there's a lot of really important findings and studies that have been proven to work, or intervention that have been proven to work well, but not necessarily in a humanitarian setting. And from these studies, then the experts actually decided what could be a minimum, or in a more emergency context. So, you know, like expert consensus, it also depends on what was their discussion, of course. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but it's a bit difficult to answer that.
No, that's perfect. Great. Thank you so much. I think it also connects to this issue of how the humanitarian research landscape has been changing and whether or not it's actually changed enough in terms of the production of research and of evidence. So I want to put this question first to Anenia, then perhaps if we have time back to you, Severin, but we might have to move to our last question before the end. But Anenia, as an end user of research, because the Sphere standards really are end users of research and evidence, how do you think that landscape needs to change to provide more accessible yet rigorous studies for such important practitioner-led initiatives like the Sphere standards?
What comes to mind is that you mentioned before, well, what's the research for? What's the evidence for? And what I'm hoping that Sphere can contribute this time around with the revision and with this idea of an evidence repository is to do better and more visibly what it actually has done before already, which is also to indicate gaps in evidence. The guidance notes have always been also the place where we could note that a certain indicator is maybe based on a bit more shaky ground than other indicators, and those indicating those, showing those gaps in evidence, be that scientific evidence or simply expert opinion or best practice, that can be a place for academics to go and say, oh, I want to do a useful study. What's the question? What is there? What is out there that needs an answer, and how can I contribute? And then so that would be one contribution that Sphere could make by simply providing a clearer explanation of what evidence its indicators and actions are based.
Great. And Severin, maybe in just 1 minute or less, what quickly do you think academics can do to fix these gaps?
I think that there's been more and more of what I find will probably help is collaborations between NGOs and universities. I'm not saying that this was not existent before, but I think even NGOs like Action Against Hunger, of course MSF with Epicentre and all of these research centers, but there's more and more, I believe, collaborations between practitioners and in developing research questions together, and then of course running the research piece together and learning from each other. And I think that's a really good way further forward. I mean, sorry. So yeah, maybe more of that.
Great, great. More partnerships. We always like that. More collaborations. Good. So we're nearing the end of the session. It went very quickly. It's because it's very interesting. And I would encourage people to follow up with the panelists for more questions or for follow-up on anything we've discussed today. But just to kind of close out, I want to go back to each of our 4 panelists and read out a question that's been submitted to us by Jerwin Jansen, who's the Director of Evidence Aid. Evidence Aid organized a consultation on the Sphere standards, so we're posting the link to that consultation document now. And Jerwin asked kind of a broad horizons question. What should the long-term strategy towards a more evidence-based approach for the Sphere Handbook look like, and what steps does it entail that we can take now? So I'd like to hear from the panelists. What do you think this looks like for the future, and what steps can people who are listening to this webinar take to support this? I'd also kind of add at the end there, if you want to comment, do you think it actually matters? This is a question we posed at the very beginning of the webinar. Does it matter that the Sphere standards, have an evidence-based approach? Is it relevant to the NGOs and the other humanitarian organizations that use them? So taking any part of those questions that you choose, we'll go to Aninia first.
Yes, thank you. Where does the evidence discussion go? I don't know, but I know that the simple fact that we're talking about evidence is already a step forward, and that it's not completely evident anymore that everybody thinks they know what evidence actually means. So we need to unpack that term, and we need to unpack what it means and what it can contribute to humanitarian practice. And Evidence Aid has been quite, also instrumental with that. And again, I think the transparency around evidence is the way to go, being very clear what we base our assumptions on, so that we can then build on that, as I've said before, indicating the gaps and then moving from there. So I think that's one way where we can go.
Great. And over to you, Severin. Your thoughts on what this long-term strategy might look like. What steps does it entail that people can take now?
What Nina just said, obviously, is very relevant and very good. I don't know that I have exactly something to contribute to that, but I'd take the opportunity of being able to speak to just add something that I wanted to say earlier about this whole idea of adding indicators so that we talk about them and so that they are included as minimum standards, although we don't really have enough information on them. And I think that one thing that would be important today, and that would probably make this whole process of having a more evidence-based Sphere Handbook, is probably, as I tried to say in the presentation, reduce the number of priority standards and indicators to having really strong, fewer indicators, and then more things in the principles and the guidance notes, and of course include them in the Sphere Handbook. And maybe as we go and as we know more about these different issues, then they can become indicators later on, once we know where they come from and how to measure them. Because I think an indicator that is not measurable or attainable will not really make things easy. Sorry, I didn't quite exactly answer your question, but I just wanted to say that.
No, that's great. That's perfect. So quality over quantity. Great. So Jude, final remarks from you?
As Aninia mentioned earlier on, the addition of the outcome indicator, I think, is quite important for in terms of the evidence base and making sure that we are doing the right thing, and if we're not, what needs to be changed. And I think the outcome indicator doesn't necessarily need to be measured by every single NGO, every single local actor, but I think that is something that the academic community can work quite closely with Sphere and with NGOs and other agencies to make sure that ultimately the outcome indicator does somehow end up being measured or quantified in some way, because I think just having that again as a starting point to make us think about what we're doing from now is very important.
Great. And final word from you, Kit. Thoughts on the future and if and why evidence might still be relevant for the Sphere standards.
Yeah, it's interesting. We find ourselves at this nexus point, if you like, where the academics are coming to the practitioners and those of us who were practitioners, I guess, and now sit in head offices. We're all kind of coming together anyway. It's happening. We're seeing a lot of it. So those steps that we need to bring robust evidence to the table and across the broader range of contexts, the call to do that is pretty strong in our sector, possibly because we're coming from such a weak base. So that's kind of happening, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's something that Sphere is driving necessarily, but perhaps benefiting from. I think Sphere as a project, if you like, over the last several years, decades, has driven us towards that professionalization, and I think by having something that we can look for, by having a framework by which we can actually measure whether we're doing what we set out to do, and whether what we're doing is having the right kind of impact on people who are affected. That discussion is definitely, I think it's going down the right path, and that this process is helping us to have that. I definitely liked bringing in the issue of attainability into the discussion, and that's something that's really been troubling us as a sector, because it's been so much around these numbers, I guess, whereas the numbers really aren't the important thing. It's about that framework to accountability that's the important piece of it.
Great. It's always good to end with a call to accountability or nod to accountability. So fantastic. It just leaves me to thank everyone who's joined us this afternoon online, and of course to our fantastic panel. Really appreciate the time and the thoughts, and we look forward to following up online and in the future as we see the Sphere Handbook getting rolled out in 2018. So thank you very much and have a great day.